Hello Tumblr, this is Pablo Tanguay, and today I am with Professor Coretha Mitchell, a professor of English at OSU, and we're going to talk today a little bit about her book, which has been getting excellent reviews and a ton of press, and you have been all over doing interviews about this book.
Yeah.
Living with Lynching, African American lynching plays, performance, and citizenship.
1890 to 1930.
1930, that's right. So tell us, first off, just a little bit about the book, and then we can talk a little more. So where did the book come from? What's it about? And we'll just start there.
Okay, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. This is fun. So the book, Living with Lynching, is pretty much an extension of the dissertation project that I did at the University of Maryland, College Park. So this job at Ohio State is my first job out of the PhD. So I worked on the dissertation probably 3.5 to 4 years, and then my first 5 years of being at Ohio State, I used that in addition to getting used to teaching and that kind of thing at this level to really take the book to the next level, really challenge myself to, you know, push the theories, push the use of theatricality as a framework, push everything to a higher level to get it to the point where it could be called a book. So that took me probably the first 5 years that I was here.
Yeah. And so you did your PhD in Maryland, and you were working on this subject matter, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and as an undergrad, you were at Ohio Wesleyan as an undergraduate, right? And you got there from a town called Sugar Land in Texas, is that right? So tell us about Sugar Land and what growing up in Sugar Land was like, and how you end up from Sugar Land, Texas, to a small liberal arts college in Ohio.
Okay, sure, yeah. So I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, and more properly Sugar Land. I always like to say that it's where the sweet people come from,
Right.
but that my students very often will contradict that later in the semester.
Sure.
But yeah, born and raised there. The truth is, you know, even though I was going to high school in the 90s, early 90s basically, because I'm black, my counselors really just didn't see me as college material. So, you know, even though I had one honors class, which was my English class, nothing I did made them see me as college material. So what that did is, it meant that I wasn't getting college counseling.
Sure.
So my colleagues who were very much being directed toward University of Texas at Austin and other institutions that my high school had strong ties with. But because I wasn't getting that kind of counseling, I just kind of had to make it up on my own. Also, my mom was working more than one job when I was in high school, so that meant that I couldn't go to the college fairs that my high school put on. So again, I had to take the initiative and figure out, okay, how am I going to do this? And I was able to find a college fair that was put on in downtown Houston, and that's the place where the recruiter from Ohio Wesleyan was, and she just kind of latched on to me because I didn't know what I was doing, but I had really good grades. And I wasn't scared to leave Texas. So they basically recruited me, and I came out here. Actually, her name is Karen Fashoon, and she's now like the vice president of diversity and inclusion for Time Warner Cable here in Columbus.
Really?
So that's been a really amazing situation to be back in Columbus and reconnect with her, and you know, so.
Sure. So what kind of, the high school that you were in, like, you did well in the high school, but you were unranked. Was there a large percentage of African American students in the high school?
No. I mean, it's basically the demographics of Ohio State. You know, it's majority white, and you know, the assumptions just are not necessarily that black students are going to excel. I mean, we like to believe that that's old news or it doesn't happen anymore, but I'm living proof that that's not just something from an earlier time.
Yeah, and then you go off to Ohio Wesleyan, which has much the same demographics, right?
Absolutely.
And what was that like as an undergraduate? So most students, or the way we think of students, I don't know if it's most, but the way that it's popularly portrayed is that students go off to college and they move into their dorm and they have all the great fun and social life of college and they learn and all of that. So was that your experience at
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, Ohio Wesleyan, I think, was perfect for me because it was small. When I was a PhD student at the University of Maryland teaching, I kept looking around thinking I would not have done well here if I had been an undergrad here. And so I always had so much respect for my students there. And the same is true here.
Yeah,
I mean, this is another really huge place. So I have a lot of respect for students who can come to these huge institutions and do well.
Yeah.
So it was the perfect institution for me because it was really small. And I would say that there were a couple things that happened at Ohio Wesleyan that were absolutely, life-changing and the kinds of things that led me to what I'm doing now. So one of those things was that I was, in my sophomore year, I believe, taking a women's studies class, or a women's literature class, actually. It was in the English department, but it was women's literature. And basically the professor was emphasizing the different ways that women's writing is suppressed. And she was talking about, how you discount women writers by saying that the topics they explore are frivolous and so on and so forth. And those kinds of things. And I kept thinking throughout the class, okay, why can't you see that this is exactly what happens to black authored texts? Like everything that you're saying about dismissing is exactly what happens with black authored texts, but we had no conversation around race in that class. And I didn't raise the issue because, I'm an undergraduate, I'm scared. I don't want her to think that I'm not learning, and I don't want her to think I'm a troublemaker, so I just kind of was quiet, but it was always going in the back of my head. And then at the end of the semester, we talked about Toni Morrison's novel, The Bluest Eye. And at that point, it no longer mattered that I never raised my question because that book blew my mind. It was a book that was basically about a dark-skinned black girl growing up, and I felt like, oh my goodness, this is everything that I would want the literature to address. If you want to say that literature can do X, Y, and Z, and you want to say that we need tools for understanding how certain literature has been suppressed and so on, this was the text that really did it for me. So what it did for me is it actually made me think about myself in terms of being not only black, but also a woman. And that was huge because coming from Texas especially, I had plenty of, experiences of racial tension or whatever. And so I understood myself to be black, and I understood myself to have certain experiences in my life precisely because I wasn't white. I didn't understand that there were certain things that would happen to me precisely because I wasn't a man. And that book is what really opened my eyes to that. So that was huge for me. The other thing that was huge for me is they had a study abroad program that was actually domestic. So I got to go to New York City and work for a magazine. Now this was huge for me because I thought the entire time I was in school that I would become the next, editor-in-chief of Essence magazine, which is a black woman's magazine. And so that's why I wanted to do the internship, and I had a great time at the internship. But before I went on that study abroad, I had a class called Women of Color that was taught by the only woman of color that the university had while I was there, or at least the department had while I was there. Her name was Anu Aneja, and it blew my mind because basically what the class showed me is that you could take literature seriously as a scholarly endeavor and not focus on Shakespeare. That seemed... It was a silent thing, right? No one said that outright, that real literature is Shakespeare. But the message was clear throughout the major.
If you look on our own website, if you look on OSU English's website, the first thing you see is Shakespeare. There's a picture of Shakespeare right there. So that's everywhere. So you get, a book, literally a book, sort of, in the old term, sort of raised your consciousness, but it sort of brought your own experiences, sort of crystallized those experiences.
Absolutely. It gave me a way, Bluest Eye gave me a way of seeing that my identity wasn't just about one part of it, that it was race as well as gender. And of course I didn't have that kind of language then, but to have that knowledge was huge for me. But what's so important about it, is that it was a way of understanding that those identity markers actually created the kinds of experiences that were coming into my life. It isn't just that I'm a black woman. It's that the way I'm treated in the society changes because I'm a black woman. It's not embedded in me. It's about how the society does things. And that's what that book helped me to do. And then building on that, when Anu Aneja gave us that class, Woman of Color Literature, and I realized, look at this huge tradition that you wouldn't even know existed if you just looked at the English major.
Yeah, right.
You wouldn't even realize that
Like,
there
let
was a
alone
tradition.
just walking around on the street, but even in the English major,
Exactly.
you can go through and learn and not have any idea that this stuff exists.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So that was mind-blowing for me because
Mm-hmm.
what it meant is that you could take this literature seriously. It wasn't that we were reading it because it was the right thing to do.
Right.
Well, let's give some space to these scholars of
Right.
color or these authors of color. It wasn't about that. She made it very clear that this is her scholarly endeavor.
Yeah.
And that blew my mind. So even though I left on that internship and had a fabulous time, she had
What
sparked
magazine did you
something
work
in me.
for in New York?
I worked for, it was called Travel Holiday.
Uh-huh.
It no longer exists. It was one of the Reader's Digest
Oh, okay.
publications
Yeah, right.
that existed back in the 90s.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it was fabulous. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
let
yeah.
me tell you how fabulous
So you guys
it
live in
was.
New York?
I lived in New York for
Right.
6 months,
Uh-huh.
right? So it was the summer before and then the fall of my senior year of college that I
Mhm.
was in New York that entire time. And here's how fabulous that internship was.
Okay.
My editor-in-chief, her name was Maggie, I can't remember her last name now, but she liked me a lot for whatever reason, and she let me go on a press trip to Puerto Rico. So I
Nice.
pretended that I was an established,
Right,
magazine travel writer,
Sure,
along
yeah.
with the other magazine
Yeah,
travel
yeah.
writers who were on this trip, and we
Uh-huh.
stayed at 2 fabulous resorts in Puerto
Uh-huh.
Rico, and I wrote up, the reports
Nice.
when I got back. Yeah.
Nice.
So
Very
that's
nice.
how good of an internship was. So the fact that I had that good experience,
Uh-huh.
but that class had already sparked this, wait a
Yeah.
second, this is a real scholarly endeavor that you can take up. That is really what led me to want to go to graduate school.
Mhm.
That class just changed everything.
And did you go to graduate school directly out of undergrad?
I did not. I tried, but
Mhm.
I did not get in the
Okay.
first time that I applied,
Uh-huh.
which actually turned out to be really good for me because what I did then is I went back home to Sugar Land, actually Houston by that point because I actually moved out on my own for that year. But I really spent that year preparing to apply again.
Yeah.
So I actually spent that year not only taking a GRE course because I don't test well at all, so I spent all this crazy money to take the GRE course and then take the GRE again. It did improve my scores, I don't remember by how much. But, and also I actually spent that year kind of just crafting a good writing sample.
Mhm.
And that actually was another part that blew my mind is that, that undergraduate class had opened my eyes when we read The Bluest Eye, but I didn't realize all of the scholarship that
Right.
existed around it. And so when I used that year to write a new writing sample,
Mhm.
I did it on The Bluest Eye, and I discovered all of this criticism, which then combined with what Anu Aneja had showed me, that this is a real scholarly endeavor,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so that year ended up being a really important time for me to come into realizing what
Mhm.
would it mean to do this as a career.
And then when you went to Maryland, was graduate school, and did you know immediately when you got there, or like what was the formation that eventually, what was the process that turned into your dissertation and then the book? So,
Yeah.
so how did that happen?
Great question. So basically, I'm going into graduate school with this idea of, okay, not only am I black, but I'm also a woman.
Mhm.
And the reason that ended up being kind of a continual important issue is that there were certain times, I lived in a small living unit on campus called the Women's House. So instead of living in the dorm, in my junior and senior year, I lived in the Women's House. So we did programming on campus to raise awareness on different issues, body image stuff, sexual harassment, reproductive rights,
Sure.
that kind of activism. And there would be times when my housemates would say things like,